Okay. If we could calm down, take your seats, please. Everyone, if you would please take your seats, we'll get underway. It's an extraordinary pleasure for me to introduce tonight's speakers. Both of them are longtime friends and people that I've worked with in a variety of circumstances. And I'm going to begin by introducing Katie. Katie is a native-born Ithacan. Her father was a professor here at Cornell, and her grandfather was Louis Agassiz Fuertes, also, I believe, associated with Cornell. So there's a long history here in Ithaca. Katie attended Cornell, where she was a music major, sang in chorus or of some sort, and then toward the end of college, met this fellow, Roger Payne. They got married, and in the fullness of time ended up in Lincoln, Massachusetts. Katie worked with the data, the whale songs that Roger had recorded, and found all sorts of interesting patterns, which he will tell you about tonight. Both Roger and Katie did a lot of field work in Argentina, and I had the great pleasure of visiting them when I had a couple of graduate students working in that area in about 1974. Then, when I joined the Lab of O in about 1981, Katie turned up, and I asked her to investigate the possibility of seeing whether there were people at Cornell interested in bioacoustics. Because at the Lab of O, there was this big library of natural sounds, and it seemed to me that the natural thing to do was to find some kind of research to be associated with that extraordinary resource. Katie did that. We managed to hire Christopher Clark, who had worked both with Roger and Katie and with me as the director of bioacoustics. Chris was interested in whales, and it was at that time that Katie visited the Portland Zoo and noticed the interesting phenomenon as she was near the elephants, that she could feel the vibrations in her chest, the same kind of a feeling that she had when they played the lowest note on the organ, in choir. And that led her to suspect there might be low-frequency sounds. And she went back and recorded them, and indeed there were. And then that led to an extraordinary amount of field work and to this remarkable elephant listening project that is still going on with lots of field work. The organization that Katie started back in 1981 or so has now grown, and just recently it's been renamed the Lisa Yang Center for Conservation Bioacoustics and was given a modest gift of $24 million as an endowment. And so I think it's clear that bioacoustics owes a lot to Katie and to Chris for their vision of how this could be important in conservation. Roger Payne was born in New York City, and the first time I met him, he was at Harvard working in Don Griffin's laboratory on bats, but he then moved to barn owls out in the barn at Drumlin Farm, which is the Mass Audubon sanctuary out in Lincoln, and he was able to demonstrate that the barn owls were able to catch mice by virtue of the sounds they made. And that was an extraordinary discovery at the time. And Roger then came to Cornell, met Carrie, and worked with Bill Dilger at the Lab of O, where he built an owl house to continue his research on owls, and I believe lived in the garage of the old Laboratory of Ornithology for some period of time. Presumably things got better later. He taught with Tom Eisner and finished his degree, appropriately enough, back in Lincoln at Drumlin Farm, this time in the garage where he did the careful acoustics work demonstrating how it was that the owls were able to do this. He then moved to Tufts and to the study of whales. The Navy had been recording underwater sounds around Bermuda, and he and Frank Watlington produced a record, the Songs of the Humpback Whales, which you've been listening to somewhat this evening as you came in. And this has been a remarkable recording. It sold something over 100,000 copies. It is the best-selling natural history recording in history, apparently. He then worked with Katie to figure out the evolution of the songs over time, and we'll hear more about that this evening. And after 6 years at Tufts, Roger moved on to the Rockefeller University, where he spent the next 18 years working at Rockefeller and with the Wildlife Conservation Society. Finally, in 1971, he became the founder and president of Ocean Alliance. It is an extraordinary pleasure to welcome them both here tonight. And Katie, are you going to begin the festivities? Thank you.
Thank you, Charlie. It's all fairly much true. And it's been fun. And if I was to sing your praises, it would take much more than the time allotted to me. But instead, I'm going to make an introduction too. A great singer, great, 25 to 30 tons, 41 to 43 feet long, and 14 feet long at birth. There are many populations of this whale worldwide, and each one, or many of them, most of them, make long migrations, sometimes 1,000 and 2,000 miles long, between the cold polar areas where they feed on krill, being baleen whales, and the warm tropical areas where they court and mate and give birth, because gestation is almost a year long. And they also do something absolutely amazing. They sing, like bird song, floating territories, but in the ocean. Well, Roger was kicking around in 1967. We were living in the outskirts of New York and had 4 young children, and somehow it was time for an adventure. And the adventure began with a quote from Melville: "Whether owing to the almost omniscient lookouts at the mastheads of the whale ships, now penetrating even through Bering's Straits and into the remotest secret drawers and lockers of the world, and the 1,000 harpoons and lances darted along all continental coasts, the moot point is," moot, M-O-O-T, isn't that a great word? "The moot point is whether Leviathan can long endure so wide a chase and so remorseless a havoc, whether he must not at last be exterminated from the waters, and the last whale, like the last man, smoke his last pipe, and then himself evaporate in the final puff." Well, Roger, I don't know whether you remember that night, but I sure do. When you read that, it was the beginning of our lives. it was so important to learn about whales. How are we going to do it? First, you have to find them, right? So you climb up on the heights of a great boat, and you look in all directions. And what are you looking for? Well, you think maybe it would be great if a whale would just breach, and then you'd know that was where he was. And on the other hand, it would also be great if you were able to see those puffs that Melville was writing about. But of course, those events are very rare, and they rely on or refer to visual sightings. And that was the wrong sense to be thinking about. As we learned when we heard about Frank Watlington in Bermuda, a man, a Navy engineer, who was very, very interested and rather secretly interested in the whales that were migrating between Newfoundland and the West Indies, passing through Bermuda waters and spending quite a lot of time there. Frank took us out on a Navy ship, 8 hours all day, looking for whales, and I think we spent a minimum of 3 minutes and a maximum of 5 minutes in the presence of a whale that was at the surface, and that was it. He was sizing us up the whole time. He was a very quiet man and rather secretive. And finally he said, "Don't suppose you all have ever heard the sounds these animals make." No, we hadn't. He took us down into the bowels of the ship and put headphones on us, and we heard something that I now want you to hear. It'll last about 5 minutes, and I'm just going to leave the picture of the whale up and let you listen. Listen for the shape of the phrases and the themes. Listen as though you're hearing it for the first time. echoes from the undersurface of the water and the bottom of the sea. 28 miles out offshore from Bermuda against one of the underwater banks. Frank, working for the Navy, was probably supposed to be collecting sounds, including explosions that were made for whatever purposes we don't know. With no break. He may do this for 23 hours without a break, blowing in the middle every 20 minutes or so. We were flabbergasted. Isn't that amazing? The song cycles around. It has the same series of themes. In fact, we can analyze it and look at it carefully, but it's kind of wonderful. I just always prefer to listen without looking at first. It's unusual on the breeding ground to hear just a solo whale singing. You usually hear a chaos with lots of individuals all singing the same song but asynchronously. And the rules of form become clear as you listen for a very long time. You can make a long song by having more repeats within any one theme. The phrase we'll call the repeating elements phrases. Let's take a look at a tracing of a spectrogram. A spectrogram is a machine rendition, sort of like music writing, a machine rendition of sound where time goes from left to right and frequency or pitch is revealed by the height of the sound that you're looking at. So this was the very song that we just listened to. You hear that beginning. Very deliberate, giving rise to another phrase of the same sort, and then getting into the high frequency sounds. And you can see that some are long and some are short. And by the time you get down to the third line, third row, we've got something that sounds like a new theme. Whoops. Sorry, my voice didn't do it. You do it. Couple of them followed by high squeaks, and then it turns into 3 followed by high squeaks. Well, the interesting thing is that if you take this apart and turn it into musical writing, sort of like a chorus or an orchestra, you discover that every whale who is singing is doing the same song. Do you see where the second one starts up? The second song starts up 1, 2, 3, 4. On the 5th line where you see those rumbles again. And then that's followed by the same sequence of high things. So it's a pattern, as are songs that people sing. It has no beginning or end. And it's particularly beautiful in this recording. I just love the way the echoes reveal the underwater structure below him. I think probably whales use their songs and their echoes to envision the kind of water that they're in. Well, after looking us up and down somewhat suspiciously and talking for a long time with Roger, sharing the same passion and the same fear about the disappearance of the species because of whaling, he said, I have been collecting little samples of whale song over a 10-year period, and I have no use for those tapes. I'm going to give them to you. You go and save the whales. How's that for an assignment? Almost the next thing that happened was that Roger put together, or I helped, but it was his vision, the recording, the famous recording. Where's my... Well, we'll show a picture of it in a while. It's in there. A big 78 recording of whales in many parts. Here it is. Here's the famous thing. Outsold all nature recordings ever made before then. And people were having babies to whale sounds and were calling us from all kinds of strange situations in which the whale songs were the middle of cult behavior and just making the lives of people richer and stranger all the time. And I took the tapes that Frank had given us from past years and started analyzing them and discovered very soon an amazing thing, that they are continuously changing. The whale song of one season gives rise to a different whale song. that it seems to be derived from the same material, and so forth. It's a continuous string of events. And so we started recording ourselves and did it for, I think, the better part of 20 years in the North Atlantic and eventually in the Pacific, in Hawaii, where there are wonderful populations of whales and where the volcanoes make a wind shadow, so it's a lot less seasick to work there. And here's just a little sample of what we found. This is just one phrase out of theme 5. Out of there, I think there were 7 themes in that year's song. In 1976, it's quite short. Ooh, ooh, mm. A year later, and all whales were singing it that way. And it was flanked by the same kind of theme on both sides. In 1977, the first 2 notes have split up. Ooh, 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 ooh. And every phrase was longer in the year before. In 1978, ooh, 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 brrr, Oh, there's a blank in the next year. Let's have you be the whales. What's it like? What are they doing? Let's go. Longer. Good work. Would you like to see the truth? You were right. And in 1980, it was 13 grunts at the end. And those are more or less average. They're traced from spectrograms, more or less average phrases. So you can see that the whale's mind was working the same way that our minds work in relation to this little series of notes. Isn't that fascinating? That was in the Pacific. In the North Atlantic at the same time, or actually between the years of 1969 and 1982, I was also analyzing songs for the presence of recognizable phrases, recognizable themes, and I consulted with other people. I wasn't the only one who thought that way. And you can see that themes 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, which started off, drop out gradually, and by 1982 have been replaced by a whole lot of other themes. It's just a gradual displacement and replacement. I have an interesting quote I'd like to read from Edward Sapir, a famous old linguist who wrote a book called Language in the early 1900s. Language moves down time in a current of its own. It has a drift. Didn't that look like a drift in that picture? Where are we? It has a drift. Every word, every grammatical element, every locution, every sound and accent is a slowly changing configuration molded by the invisible and impersonal drift that is the life of the language. The evidence is overwhelming that this drift has a certain consistent direction. Its speed varies enormously according to circumstances that it is not easy to define. The general drift of a language has its depths. At the surface, the current is relatively fast. In certain features, dialects drift apart rapidly. By that very fact, these features betray themselves as less fundamental to the genius of the language than the more slowly modifiable features in which the dialects keep together long after they have grown to be mutually alien forms of speech. But this is not all. The momentum of the more fundamental, the pre-dialectic drift, is often such that languages long disconnected will pass through the same or strikingly similar phases. I think that there's an extraordinary parallel between what we're seeing here in the whale songs and that. Well, all the males, well, we don't know that all the males sing. We only know that the singers are not females. They're always males. And to sing is to change. And we ask ourselves, why? Are they forgetting? Do they forget the song when they migrate toward the pole for their feeding? No, there's lots of evidence that they did not forget. Is it like fashion? Well, it's cultural, it's learned. They're learning it from each other. Otherwise, how would it be this way? Like improvisation in human music, changes in whale songs seem to be generated by an internal process. And as in music, the imitation that then occurs reveals listening and learning. Song changing in whales seems to be a clear example of cultural evolution in non-human animals. Well, gee whiz, I could go on and on. What's the problem here? Does it not want to change? Is it because new individuals are coming into the population? Well, you can identify individuals by the fingerprints on the ventral surface of their flukes. There's one, there's one, there's one. And with a lot of luck, we were able to get photographs of a whale that we knew was a singer. And what we have found is that the singer, the individual, changes his song in the same way that the group changes its song. So I'm going to end with the Earth. Phenomenal work has been going on in the South Pacific while all of these things about within population song change was being measured by us. Other folks, Ellen Garland in particular, have been recording whales, humpback whales, on both sides of Australia, and out in the French, what are they called? Polyps, something. Polynesia, right, and in Tonga, and those islands between Australia and South America. And they have found that at times a whole song will move thousands of miles and show up in another place. The best guess of how this is happening is that is because there are feeding grounds in the Antarctic where some of these populations from very distant locations are meeting during the feeding season. We're going to hear more about feeding tomorrow. We're going to hear wonderful things tomorrow. I think I should stop there and thank everybody for all the help many of you have given us and this study, and give Roger a chance. Thank you, Roger. Thank you, everybody.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Oh, sorry. Well, thank you, Katie. That first time that Katie and I heard the song of a humpback whale was in the engine room of Frank Watlington's wooden minesweeper, the sister ship of Cousteau's first Calypso, by sheer chance. Frank used the ship to tow hydrophones so he could hear the distant test explosions of dynamite, such as those on the recording that Katie played for us. Once we boarded his boat, Frank took Katie and me into the engine room, where there was a reel-to-reel tape recorder. A deafeningly loud diesel generator was roaring away next to it. Frank took a tape from his pocket, he threaded it across the recorder heads, hit start, listened through his headphones for a moment while adjusting the gain, and then handed the headphones to me. As I put them on, he leaned in close and, almost shouting to be heard above the shattering noise from that generator, he said, "I think these may be humpback whale sounds." Although the listening environment could hardly have been worse, like hearing a lullaby as you stand next to a jet engine at full revs, the sound I heard were astounding. I was completely unprepared for such a performance. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard in nature. As I listened, I realized that the world had no idea that whales were capable of such bold virtuosity. And if Frank was right, and whales were indeed the authors of these sounds, we later demonstrated that Frank was right, it was clear that humans and whales share a startlingly similar musical aesthetic. Theirs were bold, daring performances with heroic riffs, soaring arias and soul-shattering bass notes, more oceanic exhalations than euphonious tones. They were, in fact, declamatory masterpieces. My mind was racing. Katie's was too, she later told me. I knew that people were killing 33,000 whales each year and that several whale species were threatened with extinction. I had been searching for a way to make the magnitude of that crime manifest, and it dawned on me that if I did my part well, the whales' voices had power enough to capture the hearts of the world, thereby becoming the whale's salvation. Well, when you have something that is so wonderfully evocative, unexpected, and shockingly lovely as whale songs, it's like finding a door that opens onto a path you can follow while trying to change the world along the way. My very first effort was to start trying to build whales into human culture, because at the time, the late 1960s, about all the general public seemed to know about whales was that they were big blubbery animals that had been hunted by our ancestors for their oil. People didn't even know that whales were now being hunted for their meat and that whaling was destroying more species and doing so faster than had ever been able to achieve before. I figured that unless people knew things about whales that were interesting, unexpected, and intriguing, there was no way that they would ever be moved enough to place their bodies between the rapacious whaling industry and its victims. This was so long ago, I hadn't yet met Paul Watson, nor had he yet become a founder of either Greenpeace or Sea Shepherd. So I decided to spend the next few years speaking with anyone who interacted in any way with the public. I went on talk radio shows and all of the late night TV programs of that time. And I spoke with celebrities, singers, composers, dancers, directors, producers, in addition to others that I had already met. In a word, I spoke with anyone who had access to a microphone and a loudspeaker of any kind. And when I did, I used every opportunity I could to shift the conversation away from, oh my gosh, you're studying whales, what is that like? To the beauty of whale songs, their plight, and what people might do to help change it. I also started going on lecture tours, which spread the word about whales. I'd also paid not just the cost of sending our kids to good schools and college, but also enabled me to take Katie and the 4 children into the field with me when I did field work. Thanks to Moby Dick, pretty much everyone had heard that sperm whales were murderously dangerous creatures. Californians knew that the 19th century whalers had called gray whales devilfish because they destroyed whaling boats so effectively. But many Californians also started watching gray whales as they migrated peacefully along their coast, just offshore. And those people began to wonder whether the stories about whales killing people were strictly true. One thing I knew about whaling was that 19th century whalers were almost universally unable to swim, and that it was that lack and not whales that killed them if a harpooned whale collided with a whaling boat while being lanced with a 12-foot-long spear. I also figured that whales have large brains and that if you were in the water with them, they would probably be as unlikely to attack you as you would be to attack something as proportionally small in relation to your size if it walked towards you slowly and steadily, but without making sudden movements or threatening displays. It seemed far more likely to me that thanks to their size, whales would be confident, and that that might cause them to investigate you cautiously. Sure, they might also threaten you or even nudge you a bit, but they would probably not follow through by launching a full attack. And I was nudged gently when I took what may have been the first chance anyone who was thick enough to try testing such a goofy theory ever took. But I wasn't killed instantly, just lifted gently, as Katie had been in a different boat the day before. Presumably, I was lifted by the whale to see what this weird thing, our boat, was, or what the wiggly thing with long appendages and all those jingle jangles hanging off it, blowing bubbles, and surrounded by a tightly adhered layer of black hair, my wetsuit, might just be. And the fact that the whales didn't attack, but milled around in apparent curiosity, was a new discovery that I promoted because I am a talentless photographer by suggesting to others that they swim with whales to film them up close. And this approach triggered a lot of people who really knew how to take pictures to get into the water with whales. And for every expedition I took from then on, I took photographers with me who spent their full time taking pictures of whales. And in some cases, that started underwater photography careers for them that outpaced anything I could ever have achieved. The result was that the world soon went from having had only 1 or 2 decent pictures of live whales to having hundreds and then thousands. And soon there were so many photographers taking pictures of live whales underwater, and the numbers of such pictures became so large and included so many good ones that every writer could afford to illustrate anything they wrote with great pictures of whales. And whales began to be not just listened to, but thought of and looked at and watched and followed and adopted and loved. When I first started out, William Cheville was the silverbacked male of whale study, He was a respected paleontologist who also had recorded the sounds of whales and porpoises, and I interacted with him on my very first summer while building equipment to study whales at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. I was a complete greenhorn, so I asked Cheville's advice about how to study the behavior of free-swimming whales in the wild. He told me firmly that he had tried a great many techniques and that it was simply a waste of time and of grant funds to try to learn anything about the behavior of free-swimming whales at sea. But I continued trying anyway, and by the end of the summer was still without any success. At which point, I think he simply became disgusted with my bad judgment for not having accepted his advice. And the result was that I never did get to ask him the questions I would have loved to hear him answer about when and in what order the extraordinary physical adaptations of sperm whales had first appeared in the history of that species. I mention this story solely to show that even as recently as the 1960s, almost nothing was known about the behavior of free-swimming whales, even by leading whale biologists of that day. What was known was pretty much limited to what could be learned from studying the dead whales the whaling industry provided. But I figured that if the only way you could find out about a species was by examining its corpses, that maybe it was time to change your approach. And anyway, beyond my curiosity about how whales are structured, I wanted to learn about whale behavior, because I felt that was far more likely to get people interested in doing something to save them. Because it was crystal clear that the whaling industry was overhunting whales so badly that bowhead, right, gray, blue, and even humpback whales were vanishingly close to going extinct. Everything the institute I later founded, Ocean Alliance, has studied since about whales are subjects that we have pursued in hopes that what we discovered would help get people interested enough in these animals to act to ensure their future. That it seems to have caught on, and frankly, beyond my wildest dreams, is evidenced by the fact that back when I started studying whales, there were probably no more than a few dozen to 100 people worldwide studying whales, dolphins, or porpoises. Whereas just today's Marine Mammal Society now contains literally thousands of professional biologists who are spending their entire careers studying cetaceans, i.e. whales, dolphins, and porpoises, in addition to other marine mammal species. In relating what whale songs triggered, I will start with the first approach I took, which turned out to be the most unpleasant part of my professional life. I started attending all of the meetings of the Scientific Committee of the International Whaling Commission, the IWC, which is the body that oversees the whaling industry's efforts to, in air quotes, sustainably manage the stocks of whales, and in doing so has failed spectacularly to achieve that goal. My trips each year to the IWC constituted the most dispiriting, irritating, and outrageously frustrating activity of my life. Every year I watched the whalers' representatives twisting, turning, and writhing as they were dragged, kicking and complaining into the modern age. Annually, the IWC provided for my personal book of records a fresh entry pertaining to the maximum frustration that I think any human spirit could endure, a record that was surpassed in the following year. It was an experience that, in my case, has only been equaled by my attempts to operate a computer. During the next 25 years that I attended the IWC meetings, the IWC concluded commissioners from the principal whaling nations, Norway, Japan, and Iceland, and that, of course, meant that there was a need for simultaneous translation for the people attending an IWC meeting for the first time, to find that they needed a guide or a translator to help them figure out what was going on, but not just to translate the words of the commissioners and scientists from the many foreign languages of their countries into English, English being the principal language of the IWC. That was very competently done. The problem was to translate from English to English, from words that were selected by their speakers to be as obfuscating as possible, but that would end up enabling the speaker to cover his or her rear when the final commission reports finally became available. Many times with such a long lag that when they appeared, no one was much interested anymore. Here's an example that concerns a period of 7 years during which Norway was required by the rules of the Commission to give data to the Scientific Committee on their fishing operations so the committee could estimate whale populations, assess the state of the stocks, and suggest viable kill quotas. Norway had her own agenda, however, and wouldn't comply, even though it is not an option, but a requirement of membership that member nations provide data on their whaling operations to the Scientific Committee every year. The made-up conversation I am offering here might have taken place during a technical committee meeting, which is a kind of practice run for the full plenary session meetings and is usually composed of an identical membership, but is headed by a different chairperson. The words in my example are not direct quotes, since one of the rules of the Commission is that you must limit your quotes to what is said in final committee reports. Anyway, in some ways, it seems more honest to use the following fictitious language, since so much of what is said is fictitious. It somehow gives a more accurate picture of what IWC meetings were really like back in those days. Commissioner from Norway. Mr. Chairman, our delegation regrets to inform the technical committee that at this year's scientific committee meeting, we were not able to provide the scientific data for which that committee has been asking. However, I am assured by the head of our scientific delegation that he and his colleagues are working on the matter diligently. They have promised this body a report of their progress at next year's meeting, and we hope we will soon see them reach a conclusion to this important work, which our delegation so much endorses and for which we have invested great effort and time. Translation. We have no intention whatever of giving the Commission our data until we are damn well ready to do so. We didn't offer it this year, and we have no intention of doing so next. What we will give the Scientific Committee next year will include none of our data except total kills and a few details that will not prove to be anything but harmless to commerce. Chairman, thank you, Norway. The Technical Committee report will reflect that fact, and we will look forward to receiving your report next year, or if possible, during the interim meeting of the Scientific Committee in January, as I am sure you recognize the urgency which the Scientific Committee chairman attaches to this matter, particularly as the completion of the work of your scientists is long overdue. Translation. You're fooling no one. It's perfectly clear that you're withholding this report from us, and I'll make that clear in my report. When the draft report of the committee comes out, we find some rather harsh words in it that were apparently composed by the chairman, but if necessary, can be blamed on the technical committee's rapporteur. It reads, draft, technical committee report, item 1.13.6, quote, Norway regretted that for the 5th year in a row, it was unable to provide the scientific committee with its data and has promised to present this to the scientific committee in the coming year, end quote. However, draft reports have to be approved by the entire technical committee, so it should be no problem for the Norwegian commissioner to get the language of the report changed so it won't cause him any problem when he has to report back to his government upon his return to Norway. The IWC chairman now says, are there any comments on the draft report as regards item 1.13.6? Pause. Norway? Norwegian Commissioner. Mr. Chairman, I would like to suggest that we strike the words for the 5th year in a row, as well as the words and promised it would present it to the committee in the coming year. The item would then read, Norway regretted that it was unable to provide the scientific committee with its data, end quote. Mr. Chairman, if I recall correctly, during our discussions of this point, there was no mention made to the effect that this might be the 5th or indeed any other year that the scientific committee has asked for Norway's data. And I know you agree with me that this committee's report should accurately reflect the committee's discussion on the matter. I also regret that I am unable to promise that our scientists will have a report for the scientific committee by next year, though I can assure you that they will be expending all of their energies to do so. Perhaps I did not make myself sufficiently clear on that point. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Translation, gotcha. And so he does, for when the report comes out, the final report of the technical committee says, quote, Norway regretted that it was unable to provide the scientific committee with its data. Norway has gotten off scot-free, and the scientific committee is no closer to having the data to work with than it was before. Nothing has changed. The Norwegian whalers will continue to ignore the majority opinion of the world and will do as they like. It is business as usual. Meanwhile, Norway and Iceland weren't consuming their frozen whale meat. They were selling it to Japan for yen, so Norwegians could buy the wonderful technological gizmos Japan was producing and that all the world wanted. Anyway, you get my point. That is why in 1991, I started going to IWC meetings only very occasionally. It just didn't seem worth the time. However, what was clear is that the real problem facing whales was no longer whaling. It had shifted. The real problem was that thousands of whales were dying from entanglement in fishing nets and from contamination by the chemicals that all of us were and still are discarding legally and illegally, intentionally and unintentionally into the air and the water, both of which eventually deposit them into the sea, simply because air can hold very little weight for very short periods and because the oceans are downhill from everything on land. But I figured before there is much chance that any government will take any steps, the political movers and shakers would want evidence of just how badly contaminated the oceans actually were. I figured that whales might provide a good assay because a species like sperm whales occurs worldwide and is known to feed higher on the food chain than baleen whales do, and therefore would reflect the human condition better because they would be more seriously polluted. Sperm whales are also divided into two populations. Females and their young are not seen at higher latitudes than 40 degrees north or 40 degrees south in either hemisphere, and males spend most of their time in polar waters, only swimming into temperate or equatorial waters to mate with females. That meant you could circle the world near the equator sampling female sperm whales, and when a large male appeared, a sample from him would show that he had kindly done you the service of bringing up from the Antarctic or down from the Arctic chemicals in his blubber that would show what he was getting in the food he'd gotten in near polar waters. This meant that you didn't have to have a ship large enough to withstand the polar winter's storms to learn what was going on there. You could use a much smaller boat and stay in calmer, near equatorial waters where you would run a smaller chance of damaging your equipment, even if your vessel was small enough so it could be dedicated full-time to a single goal of studying whales. The whole idea of Ocean Alliance undertaking such a voyage seemed daunting, and I hoped some other much larger entity like the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute or Scripps Institute of Oceanography would take on the task. However, no large organization showed any signs of such interest. So in the end, I decided that in spite of the fact that an around-the-world voyage to collect samples from sperm whales was a project that was probably beyond the competence of a small organization like Ocean Alliance, that if no one else was going to do it, and if the evidence a global voyage would provide was needed as urgently as it clearly was, that in the end, the only way to get it to happen was to do it ourselves. The result was our Voyage of the Odyssey, a boat we owned by that name, which took us 5.5 years, saw the Odyssey bring home 955 lead pencil eraser-sized biopsy samples from sperm whale blubber and skin after traveling 160,000 kilometers and checking into and out of the coastal waters of 22 countries, some of them repeatedly, after clearing customs in 121 ports in order to exchange crew and or to obtain supplies, repairs, fuel, or parts. And during all of this, no one was ever seriously enough hurt to need the attention of a doctor. We analyzed these samples for the full suite of toxic and non-toxic metals and discovered something that no one had anticipated. Although we found the expected toxic metals like lead, mercury, and aluminum in every area we sampled, in all but 2 of the samples we were able to analyze, we also found highly toxic concentrations of a toxic metal, chromium, a major carcinogen we had not expected to find in whales. But here it was, and the highest concentrations of it were present in places that were where the sperm whales were in waters that were that were as far from the industrial world as you could get. An enigma that remains unexplained, and that, in spite of all we could do to bring it to the world's attention, is still all but entirely ignored and unremediated, even though the concentrations we found were higher than concentrations of chromium in the skin of workers who had spent more than 20 years working in chromium extraction plants and had died of lung cancer, the usual cancer that high concentrations of chromium triggers in humans. The fact that the voyage of the Odyssey had such a surprising and global result, but that we could make no progress in changing the world's exposure to chromium, taught me that even the availability of a careful study based on solid data, revealing a serious result not seen before, is not enough to get people to act. It was an important contribution, yes, but it didn't have whatever force it is that gets people to change their behavior. Something else seemed to be needed. What was that something? I began to believe that it probably included awe and wonder, and that whatever it was, it had to be something that could cause people to put their untested faith in it, i.e., that it must have some of the characteristics of a religion. That is something I'll have a lot more to say about tomorrow when discussing the latest SETI project that we're doing. But I want to wind up my remarks with a couple of interesting and unexpected outcomes from the work we did. One happened when the National Geographic decided to include a recording in an issue of its magazine. Is what was called an Evatone record, one of those flexible discs that got bound into a book or a magazine and that you could tear out along a dotted line, put on your record turntable, set the needle down in its groove and play. The Geographic at the time had 10.5 million subscribers. And after the Geographic and I had finished the record, someone there had to call up Evatone Records and order 10.5 million copies of the record. And that remains to this day the largest single print order in the history of the recording industry. It is, of course, a kind of cheat statistic, since Michael Jackson and many other artists have sold several times that number of the same album, but no one with any company has ever made such a large single order so big. It took the whales to achieve that. The other and perhaps most exciting thing I wanted to mention was getting a recording of humpback whales on board Voyagers 1 and 2. They are now 11 billion miles from Earth, but more of that tomorrow as well. I've said nothing about our work on right whales in Argentina, though it is now in its 51st year and is very much ongoing. But this opportunity to appear with Katie makes me want to end with some comments about the years when we were married and working together, as I always believe it is best to end on a more personal and less formal note. When I decided to study the right whales of Patagonia, I was determined from the start to take my family with me. My sponsors were dead set against it, but I persisted, politely explaining that I knew if my children came with me that I would not spend so much time worrying about them and could therefore work with better effect. I also reasoned that children could serve a uniquely important role on an expedition, becoming ports during the emotional storm with which adults who are living in close quarters must sometimes cope. My kids were wonderful about putting up cheerfully with the hardships of that kind of life, which made it harder for the adults to whine and complain about things the children were enduring without complaint. During the 3 years from April 1971 to April of 1974, our children slept in sleeping bags, often on hard ground, more nights than they slept in beds, but were always cheerful about it. It is my belief that a positive attitude is more important than any other human attribute. My children had wonderful attitudes, they still do, and they contributed positively to expeditions. Taking them with us worked, and is a thing of which I am proud, a theory that turned out to be right. And having the family along gave our work a dimension I would have missed had they remained at home. I have often been asked, and I'm sure Katie has too, whether we weren't afraid of raising our kids in such a wild place. We were not. I feel that our years in Patagonia demonstrate that children face many fewer life-threatening dangers at the ends of the earth, certainly nothing to match the dangers of growing up in a city. At the end of each trip, they were healthier in mind and body than when we left. It also seemed to me that my kids left their city-trapped friends standing. Growing up far from civilization also demonstrated cleanly that some of the stories told by the previous century's hunters and whalers were simply lies, told by timid, homesick men, stories that never would have been written had their wives and children been along. For example, "Daddy, that's not what Sally said happened. She saw it too. Mommy did. She could tell you. You could ask her about it if you want to, Daddy." End of example. Children keep you honest. Our days in Argentina were the happiest I ever had with my first family, and so it seems unaccountable that having discovered a means of continuing such an idyllic life that I did not take up permanent residence in the Eden of Patagonia. I have often thought that the thing which prevents me from living a clement and unfeigned life in the wilderness is a kind of perverse obedience to the tenets of social responsibility that I seem doomed to obey slavishly until I die. It is a kind of disruptive accountability, a maddened sense of duty, a self-imposed levy or tariff that I continue to wrest like some deranged extortionist from what might otherwise be a quiet and amiable existence, immersed in science and in the serenity and healing that comes from the kind of life I once tasted for 22 months in Patagonia, in the peace and tranquility of wildness, safe above whales. Having failed to escape the thrall of a social conscience, I now rely on the sea to save me from what I would deem the final degradation, to die in some city such as my birthplace, New York, in the eye of the human storm. I pray that when my time comes, and it's getting closer, the sea will intercede on my behalf, negotiating for me an armistice with life, however brief, in which I can leave this world in peace. Camus must have had something of the same feeling about the sea, for in one of his notebooks is this passage: "If I were to die in the midst of cold mountains, unknown by the world, cast off by my own people, my strength at last exhausted, the sea would, at the final moment, flood into my cell, come to raise me above myself and help me to die without hate." Thank you.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you, Katie. We'll now take questions from the audience, please.
If there are any. Yes.
Katie, has anybody ever looked at the audio response of a whale and compared it with the vocalization to make something sound like the whale would hear? You know what I mean? Like sometimes, I don't know if I'm saying it quite right, but we hear the beautiful songs of the whale, but how's the females hearing the song? And could I make myself very clear?
Yeah, it's interesting that I don't think anybody's ever seen humpback whales mating. If it was desirable to have an inventive mate, you might expect to see more mating when new material is coming in, don't you think? I'm not quite answering your question.
Maybe the whales don't hear exactly the frequency response that a human hears. And maybe they're hearing the song completely different than what we hear.
Yeah, how are the whales hearing? Can you answer that? Can anybody answer that? What do you say, Adam?
Whales, of course, being terrestrial animals, terrestrial mammals going back into the sea, have much the same inner ear that we do. And by looking at the anatomy of the vascular membrane in the inner ear, we can actually get a very good understanding of what their frequency range is. And we have been able to show certainly that they are capable of hearing sounds higher than humans can hear in the 21 plus kilohertz range, and can hear and respond to sounds at that frequency. They probably can, their ear is built to receive low frequencies very well. So it's not unreasonable in my mind to think that their hearing, their perception, at least of the ear, could be very similar to ours. Because our inner ears are actually very similar.
I regret to say I can't hear either questions or answers from here. There was some discussion about right whales mating. I mean humpbacks mating, and although we've never seen it for sure, in right whales, it's the thing you see most often. Right whales seem to do the same, use mating as for the same purposes that humans do, for something far more than just procreation.
We have 3 written questions here. Natalie, what do females like in a male singer? Hey, we don't know. Is she looking for creativity or a good voice? Good question. Matt Hare asks, what is known about the meaning of humpback songs? Why do they sing? Is that knowable, and how? And I would simply say that there's a very strong parallel between singing in whales and in most songbirds. The males are doing most of the singing. They're in competition with one another, and their song is leading to copulation and breeding. Anybody, you can help me in that one, Charlie. Is that good?
I think that's right. I think you got it.
Yeah. And Trish has got a question, but I've got a...
Could I add one thing here?
Yeah.
The question of the function of these songs and whether females are selecting for them, I think everybody believes that it's very likely that females are selecting. And one of the interesting questions that was posed by Jim Darling, one of the people studying these whales, humpbacks, was that maybe all it was a demonstration of how long the male could hold his breath while he made all these noises. And the important part about that is that the male is unable to fake the moment, or hide rather, the moment when he comes to the surface to get a breath, because the thermal structure of the water is such that the refraction of sound as he nears the surface makes whatever anybody listening at a moderate depth hear becomes fainter. And so he can't hide the fact that he's sneaking a breath. They do take breaths without interrupting the structure of the song. And it's just the way if I was singing, glory, glory, hallelujah, I don't stop to breathe. I tuck my breaths in so as not to interrupt the performance of the song. And humpback whales do that also.
Trish, do man-made explosions in the ocean affect whale songs? Well, the songs continue. Chris wasn't, yeah.
So, there's lots of different whale species, Odontoceti and Mycetoceti, baleen whales and toothed whales. It seems the toothed whales have a very complex, can you hear me, Raj?
Yes, just.
Great. I'm talking about Odontoceti versus Mycetoceti species of cetaceans. Okay? And so,
Yes.
so there's sounds that like sperm whales make, these codexes they're called, and they're complicated. They're used for food finding, but they're also used in communication with others of their kind. And humpback whales, this lyrical aside from humpback whales, which are Mycetoceti, is, I think, trumped by blue whales, which actually use the thermal incline in the water to bounce the sound that they make around the curvature of the earth, because they're solitary animals and they make this enormously loud noise, which was recorded and sped up in a record called Deep Voices, which I had a copy of but lost in my wanderings. But I just wondered if either of you have heard blue whales or any of that, because that's my particular area of interest currently. I'm working on a project about blue whales, but could you guys talk a little bit about blue whales?
Yeah, I certainly heard them and seen them.
Yeah.
And I calculated using the formulas that the US and Soviet governments paid millions to obtain and verify how far these whales might be heard. And if you look at a more quiet ocean, before these sounds drop down to the level of background noise on a relatively calm day around the whale, it can be a raging storm elsewhere, but as long as you're talking about the vicinity that the whale is listening in, you calculate the maximum distance these sounds could travel as they pass, not just by three-dimensional expansion and where the loss of energy is inversely proportional to the square of the distance, but in fact, you save a whole order of magnitude, basically, and they can hear each other a maximum of 13,000 miles, or could, back before the ocean was totally polluted, as it now is, with ship's traffic noise. And that sort of wild, crazy statement, which most people don't believe, almost destroyed my career when I brought it out. And now it's realized, no, of course. And in fact, there was a group of people who specialize in sonar for the Navy who I spoke before some years ago, and I was supposed to talk an hour. It ended up taking 5 hours, and the conclusion of the crowd was, no, Payne, you're underestimating how far these sounds actually could be heard. And also, they are probably transmitted to each other, not just through the water, which only goes at about a mile a second, but through the rock of the earth, which goes much faster. So it's nobody has followed that up enough. And the person who's come closest is Katie's wonderful work on elephants, which I hope you get her to talk about too. Yeah. We need to hear that.
Thanks, Raj.
Mary Alice.
Can you talk a little bit about how they make the sounds?
Well,
They're not using their breath, right?
it seems to be, but I'm going to take a guess and again turn to Adam, that there are two chambers and vocal folds in between them. And when air passes past those vocal cords, the sounds are made. Tell us better.
Precisely.
Oh, good. Hey, precisely.
Well, there are the lungs, of course, and most of us have heard which are actually vocal folds. And it turns out from some work done by someone else, I'm just reporting their work, humpback whales also have vocal folds, but ours go this way, theirs run parallel to their long axis. And so there's the lungs, there's the vocal folds, and then they have a distal sac beyond that. And so presumably the air is being forced from the lungs over the vocal folds into the distal sac, and then the air is recycled. Because we know they can vocalize for 20 minutes at length, 20 minutes at a time, without surfacing, without releasing the air. So the air is obviously being has to be shuffled back and forth. But again, it's, they're very closely related to land animals, and their vocal production seems to be, again, similar still to land animals.
Are we ready to go in peace? Let's go in peace. Thank you.
Oh, it wasn't too good. Let's keep going here. I gotta do the other. Good, thank you.